In November of 1922, 7 men gathered in a room in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and divided up a river. They drew an imaginary line across the middle of it, split the water into 2 equal halves, and promised each half a fixed amount, every year, in perpetuity. It was a monumental act of politics and engineering, the deal that would make the entire modern American West possible. There was just one problem. The river did not actually have that much water. The men in that room had measured its flow during the single wettest stretch it had seen in centuries, and they mistook that fluke for the normal state of things. So they handed out more water than the river carries. And here is the part that should stop you cold. A scientist who had actually spent years measuring that river warned them right then that the numbers were too high, that the water simply was not there, and they signed the deal anyway. That agreement, written in 1922, still governs the Colorado River today, essentially unchanged, and roughly 40 million people across 7 states, from Los Angeles to Denver to Phoenix to Las Vegas, still build their entire lives on the promise those men made about water that was never really there. And right now, as I am telling you this, with the 2 great reservoirs of the West falling to levels not seen in more than 60 years, that 100-year-old miscalculation is finally, catastrophically, coming due. Let me show you how it happened. To understand why any of this matters, you first have to understand what the Colorado River is and what it does. The Colorado is not a particularly large river by global standards. It is not the Mississippi or the Amazon, but it runs through the driest, thirstiest part of the United States, and that makes it arguably the most important river on the continent. It begins high in the Rocky Mountains, gathering snowmelt, and then it carves its way southwest for nearly 1,500 miles through Colorado, Utah, Arizona, cutting the Grand Canyon itself before crossing into Mexico on its way to the Gulf of California. Or at least that is where it used to go. Today, so much of the river is pulled out along the way that it almost never reaches the sea anymore. For most of the year, the mighty Colorado simply peters out in the sands of northern Mexico, miles short of the ocean it once fed, its delta reduced to cracked mud. A river that carved the Grand Canyon now dies of thirst in the desert before it can finish its own journey. And along that path, before it vanishes, it is the lifeline for a huge chunk of the American Southwest, a region that is about 85% desert or near desert. Roughly 1 in every 10 people in the entire United States relies on this single river in some way. It provides water to around 40 million people across 7 states. It supports 30 Native American tribes and 2 states in Mexico, and it underpins an economy estimated in the trillions of dollars. Without this one river, the cities that we now think of as fixtures of the map, Las Vegas, Phoenix, much of Los Angeles, and San Diego, would be impossible. The farms that grow a huge share of America's winter vegetables would be barren sand. Everything out there, the lawns, the swimming pools, the golf courses, the fields, the factories, all of it, exists because of the water in this single river. Now, back in the early 20th century, the West was booming, and one state was booming hardest of all, California. Its population was exploding, its farms and cities were spreading, and it was hungry for water. And this created a genuine crisis for the other states in the river's watershed because of a peculiar rule at the heart of Western water law. It's called prior appropriation, and it's often summed up in 5 words. First in time, first in right. What it means is that whoever puts the water to use first gets the permanent legal right to it. It doesn't matter where the water comes from or who lives nearby. If you use it first, it's yours, forever. And you can see the terror that created for the slower-growing states upstream: Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico. These were the states where most of the river's water actually originated, up in the snowy mountains. But they were developing slowly. California was developing fast. So under first in time, first in right, there was a very real danger that California would grab and use the entire river before the upstream states had a chance to, and then legally own it in perpetuity. The states where the water was born could end up locked out of their own river, watching it flow past them to fill someone else's fields. They needed a way to lock in their share before California could take it all, And that fear is what drove everyone to the negotiating table. Enter Herbert Hoover. Before he was president, Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce, and he was tasked with chairing the negotiations between the 7 states, and the deal they struck was, politically, a stroke of genius. The problem with dividing a river among 7 states is that it's almost impossible to get 7 parties to agree on 7 different numbers. So Hoover and the negotiators sidestepped that entirely. Instead of splitting the river 7 ways, they split it 2 ways. They divided the whole basin into an upper basin, the 4 upstream states, and a lower basin, the 3 downstream states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. And they drew the dividing line at a spot called Lee's Ferry in Arizona, right at the mouth of the Grand Canyon. And then they made the core promise of the entire agreement. Each basin would get 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year. Now, an acre-foot is just the unit water managers use. It's the amount of water it would take to flood an acre of land, roughly a football field, 1 foot deep. It's about 326,000 gallons. So 7.5 million acre-feet to each basin, 15 million acre-feet total, split right down the middle, guaranteed forever. They signed it on the 24th of November, 1922. And it worked. This compact became the foundation of what people called the Law of the River, and it unlocked everything that came after: the construction of Hoover Dam, the creation of Lake Mead, the vast network of canals and aqueducts that turned the desert green. On the strength of that one agreement, the modern West was built. Now, there's one more piece of the compact you need to understand, because it explains almost every fight happening on the river today. When they split the river at Lee's Ferry, they didn't just say each basin gets 7.5 million acre-feet. They wrote in a specific obligation for the upstream states. The upper basin was required to make sure that it did not deplete the river's flow at Lee's Ferry below, an aggregate of 75 million acre-feet over any 10 consecutive years. In plain terms, the upstream states have a legal duty to keep sending a certain amount of water downstream to the lower basin, no matter what. Even in a terrible drought year, even if it means shorting their own farmers and cities, the water has to keep flowing past that line. And if they ever fail to deliver it, the lower basin can, in theory, issue what's called a compact call, forcing sudden, catastrophic cutbacks on the upstream states to make up the difference. It has never actually happened, but the threat of it hangs over every decision the upper basin makes. It is the hammer at the heart of the whole agreement, and getting everyone to sign was not smooth. One state in particular hated the deal: Arizona. Arizona looked at the arrangement and saw its powerful neighbor, California, positioned to dominate the lower basin's share, and it refused to ratify the compact for years. In fact, Arizona held out for 21 years, not signing on until 1944, and the feud got genuinely heated. At one point, in the 1930s, Arizona was so furious about California building a dam that diverted the river that the governor actually sent National Guard troops to the riverbank to try to stop the construction, a moment people still half-jokingly call the time Arizona deployed its navy. That is how bitter the fight over this water has always been, right from the start. But the most important thing about that room in Santa Fe in 1922 may be who was not in it. 2 enormous stakeholders had no seat at the table and no vote in how their own water was divided. The first was Mexico, the country at the very end of the river, which would not get a guaranteed share of the water until a treaty in 1944, and even then, only what was left after the United States took its cut. And the second, and far more troubling, were the Native American tribes. There are around 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin, many of whom had lived along this river for centuries and held some of the oldest and most senior water rights of anyone. And the compact dealt with all of them, all 30 nations and their rights, in a single dismissive sentence, essentially saying the agreement wouldn't be construed as affecting whatever obligations the government might have to the tribes. They were an afterthought, a footnote in the division of a river that had sustained their peoples since long before any of the states existed. Many of those tribes are still fighting, to this day, to get the water they were promised on paper actually delivered. But the entire deal rested on a single number. To divide the river's water, you first had to know how much water the river actually had. And this is where it all goes wrong. This is the original sin baked into the foundation of the American West. Here was the problem the negotiators faced. In 1922, nobody had been measuring the Colorado River for very long. The science of gauging river flow was young, and out in that remote canyon country, there were barely any measuring stations at all. The gauge at Lee's Ferry itself, the very point they chose as the dividing line, had only been installed the year before, in the summer of 1921, so they had only a couple of decades of real data to work with, and they took that short record and they averaged it, and they concluded that the Colorado River carried somewhere around 17 to 18 million acre-feet of water a year. And based on that, splitting off 15 million to the two basins seemed not just safe, but conservative. It looked like they were leaving a comfortable cushion of a few million acre-feet in reserve. But that short stretch of record they relied on, roughly the first 2 decades of the 20th century, happened to be one of the wettest periods the river had seen in the last 500 years. It was a fluke, an anomaly. They had caught the river in an unusually generous mood and assumed that was simply how it always behaved. We know this now with real certainty, because scientists can reconstruct the river's flow going back more than 1,000 years by studying the growth rings of old trees, which record wet and dry years. And what those tree rings reveal is that the true long-term average flow of the Colorado is not 17 or 18 million acre-feet. It is closer to 14 or 15 million. In other words, the compact of 1922 divided up several million acre-feet of water that on average does not exist. They promised more water than the river has ever reliably carried, and the most damning part of the whole story is that they knew, or at least they were told. There was a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey named E.C. LaRue, a man who had spent years studying the Colorado, measuring it, walking its banks, understanding it better than almost anyone alive. And LaRue looked at the numbers being used in the negotiations and raised the alarm. He calculated a substantially lower average flow than the one the negotiators were relying on. He warned that the river could not deliver what they were about to promise, that the allocations were too high, and he urged them to be far more cautious about how big a share each side was allowed to claim. He was, in the most literal sense, the expert in the room on this exact question, and they ignored him, because the politics demanded a deal, and a deal demanded a big, generous number that gave everyone a large slice to fight over. A smaller, more honest number would have meant a smaller pie, harder bargaining, and maybe no agreement at all. So they went with the optimistic figure, waved off the warning, and signed. The West was built on a number that a scientist had specifically told them was wrong. So the obvious question is, if the flaw was there from the very first day, why didn't the whole thing collapse immediately? Why did it take 100 years for the bill to come due? And there are two answers. The first is simply that, for decades, the states didn't actually use all the water they'd been promised. The upper basin especially was slow to grow, so for a long time, the demand on the river stayed comfortably below what the river was providing. As long as nobody was drawing their full share, the gap between the paper promises and the real river stayed invisible. Nobody felt the shortfall because nobody was reaching for the bottom of the bucket yet. But the second reason is the crucial one, and it's the mechanism that hid the flaw for the better part of a century. They built reservoirs, enormous ones. Behind Hoover Dam, an engineering marvel of its age, rising more than 700 feet out of the Nevada rock, they created Lake Mead, which became the largest reservoir in the United States. And later, behind Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, they created Lake Powell. Together, these two artificial lakes, when full, could hold something like 4 years' worth of the entire river's flow, staggering amounts of water stored up in the desert. And what a reservoir does, fundamentally, is act like a giant savings account for water. And these reservoirs were built in part because the river is wildly unpredictable from year to year. It doesn't deliver a smooth, steady flow. It swings violently between wet years and dry years. To see just how much, consider that in 1983, after a huge snow year, so much water came pouring down the Colorado that the reservoirs nearly overflowed. Lake Powell came dangerously close to overtopping its dam, and crews had to scramble, even bolting sheets of plywood onto the top of the spillway gates to hold the water back, while the spillways themselves were being torn apart by the sheer force of the flood. So the dams were designed to tame that chaos, to catch the floods and store them up, and to smooth out the lean years by drawing the savings back down. In the wet years, when the river runs high, the reservoirs fill up. In the dry years, when the river runs low, you draw the reservoirs down to make up the difference. And this is the key. As long as those reservoirs stayed full, you could keep handing out more water on paper than the river actually delivered, and simply cover the shortfall out of storage. The gap between the promise and the reality was real, and the bill was being paid every single year. It was just being paid quietly, invisibly, by slowly drawing down the water in the reservoirs. For most of the 20th century, the entire flaw in the 1922 Compact was hidden behind billions upon billions of gallons of stored water. The reservoirs were the buffer that let a broken promise keep functioning. Now, before we get to how that buffer ran out, I want to correct something you're probably picturing in your head, because it matters enormously for understanding this crisis. When most people imagine the Colorado River running dry, they picture cities. They picture the fountains of Las Vegas, the green lawns of Los Angeles, the swimming pools of Phoenix. And it's true that tens of millions of people drink this water, but the cities are not the main story, not even close. The overwhelming majority of the Colorado River's water, by most measures somewhere around 70 to 80% of all the water that gets consumed, does not go to cities at all. It goes to agriculture. It irrigates around 5.5 million acres of farmland across the West. And here is the detail that surprises almost everyone. A huge share of that farm water, the single largest use of the entire river, does not grow food for people directly. It grows food for cattle. Alfalfa and grass hay, the crops used to feed livestock. So when you strip it all down, the mightiest river in the American Southwest, the one holding up 40 million lives, is spending most of its water to grow feed for cows. Meanwhile, and this is important for fairness, the cities have actually done a remarkable job. Many of the big western cities have cut their total water use over the past couple of decades, even as their populations have grown by huge margins through conservation, efficient fixtures, smarter pricing, and tearing out lawns. The truth is that the cities, the thing everyone blames, have largely tightened their belts. The elephant in the river is agriculture, and specifically agriculture to produce meat and dairy. And that fact makes the whole crisis vastly more difficult to solve, because now you're not just talking about shorter showers. You're talking about a century-old farming economy and the livelihoods and communities built around it, all resting on cheap, abundant water that is now disappearing. Because in the 21st century, the buffer finally started to run out. The hidden bill came due. Beginning around the year 2000, the Colorado River Basin entered what scientists now call a megadrought. And this was not just an ordinary dry spell. Using those same tree ring records, researchers have determined that the stretch of dryness the region has endured since 2000 is the most severe multi-decade drought in more than 1,200 years, and it is being made significantly worse by climate change in a way that scientists have a name for. They call it a hot drought. It's not only that less precipitation is falling, it's that the higher temperatures are baking more moisture out of the system. Warmer air means more water evaporates from the soil and the reservoirs. It means more of the winter precipitation falls as rain instead of snow and melts too early, so less of it flows into the river when it's needed. The heat itself is stealing water, and the result is stark. Since the year 2000, the river's flow has averaged only around 12.5 million acre-feet a year. That is roughly 20% below the average of the previous century, and it is far, far below the 17 or 18 million that the 1922 Compact assumed. So now, look at the arithmetic. The promises on paper add up to more than 16 million acre-feet a year. Once you count both basins, the extra allowance for the lower basin, and the water owed by treaty to Mexico, and the river is delivering around 12.5. That is not a rounding error anymore. That is a gap of roughly 4 million acre-feet every single year between what was promised and what actually shows up. And with the states now fully developed and reaching for their entire allocations, and with no more slack left in the system, that enormous gap has been coming straight out of the reservoirs, straight out of the savings account. And after 2 decades of that, the account is nearly empty. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 great reservoirs that were nearly brimming full at the turn of the century, have fallen and fallen and fallen. They have dropped toward the lowest levels ever recorded since the day they were first filled, and there are hard, physical floors waiting at the bottom. At a certain level, the water in a reservoir drops too low to spin the turbines, and the dam stops generating the electricity that millions of people rely on. And below that, there is an even more frightening threshold, one that water managers speak about with real dread. They call it dead pool. Dead pool is the level at which the water behind the dam is so low that it can no longer physically pass through the dam at all. The river, in effect, stops. If a reservoir hits dead pool, the water for everyone downstream simply cannot get to them. The buffer doesn't just shrink, it fails completely. Which brings us to right now. To this exact moment in 2026, because this is not history. This is a live emergency unfolding as we speak. In 2021, for the first time ever, the federal government formally declared a shortage on the Colorado River, which triggered mandatory cuts to the water deliveries of Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. That had never happened before in the history of the compact. Things got so dire that by 2022, federal officials took the extraordinary step of telling the states they needed to find a way to cut their combined water use by an enormous amount, on the order of 2 to 4 million acre-feet, and to do it fast, or the government would do it for them. The states scrambled, and in 2023, helped along by one unusually wet winter and by billions of federal dollars essentially paying farmers and cities to leave their water in the reservoirs, they managed to cobble together a temporary agreement to get through the next few years. But everyone understood it was a patch, a stopgap, not a solution. It bought time. It did not fix the math. Because the temporary rules that have been holding the whole system together, agreements patched together in 2007 and again in 2019, are set to expire at the end of this year, 2026. So for the past several years, the 7 states have been locked in tense, high-stakes negotiations to decide what comes next. To decide essentially how to share the pain of a river that no longer has enough water to keep its own promises, and they have failed to agree. The dispute has hardened into a bitter standoff between the two basins. The upper basin states argue that they already live within the means of the river, that they never even use their full share because the water isn't there, and that the shortfall is the lower basin's problem to fix, since the lower basin has historically used more than its allotment. As Colorado's chief negotiator has put it bluntly, this is a math problem. You cannot keep releasing more water from the reservoirs than flows into them. The lower basin, meanwhile, insists that everyone has to share in the cuts, and some of its leaders have said they won't sign any deal that doesn't force the upper basin to give something up too. Deadline after federal deadline has come and gone with no agreement. And so, just days ago, the federal government stepped in and released its own plan for how to operate the reservoirs after 2026, precisely because the states could not agree among themselves, and someone had to have rules ready before the old ones expire. And as all of this plays out, the numbers on the ground are grim. The combined amount of water now sitting in Lake Mead and Lake Powell has fallen to a low point not seen since the 1960s, since before Lake Powell was even finished filling for the first time. One of those reservoirs is sitting at barely more than a quarter full, hovering just above its all-time record low. The great savings account of the West is nearly drained. The river is running on its last reserves. The 100-year-old law still insists it carries water that it does not, and the 40 million people who depend on it are watching their leaders fail, so far, to agree on who gives up what. So let me leave you with the heart of all this. In 1922, 7 men sat in a room and made a promise about a river, using a number they had every reason to know was wrong, after a scientist looked them in the eye and told them it was wrong. And for 100 years, the West grew on that promise. Cities rose out of the sand. Farms bloomed in the desert. 40 million lives were carefully arranged around an amount of water that on paper existed, and in the riverbed did not. The great reservoirs hid that lie for as long as they possibly could, absorbing the difference year after year, quietly emptying so that no one had to face the truth. But you cannot drink a promise. You cannot refill a dying lake with a legal document. The river never had the water that the compact so confidently gave away. It simply took a century and the worst drought in over 1,000 years for the arithmetic to finally, unavoidably catch up. And now 40 million people are living in real time in the gap between what was promised in that room in Santa Fe and what was ever really flowing through the canyon. If this opened your eyes, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe, because it helps us keep digging into the decisions and the miscalculations that quietly shape the world we live in. And if you want to see another story of how the thirst of a Western city reshaped an entire landscape, of how Los Angeles reached across 100 miles of desert and drained a whole valley dry to feed its own growth, go watch our video on the Owens Valley and the water wars that built LA. It is the same story of water and power and who gets to decide. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.